I took a solo trip to Québec City, Canada this past November, and I decided to try vlogging it for the first time. I wasn't very comfortable speaking in front of a camera, so most of my clips from that trip were just some scenic shots and some very short clips of the food I was eating. And while I could have made this video just an aesthetic montage with just some music in the background and leave it at that, I kind of wanted to be able to provide a bit more information and value with this video. It's been a few months since I took this trip, but I've collected my receipts and gathered all the information that I need to provide you with the full breakdown of all of my expenses and itinerary from this trip, and to share and show that traveling doesn't have to be that expensive, especially as a solo traveler. Let's get right to it. I personally try to go on solo trips as regularly as I can. Right now my average is once a year, but one day my goal is to ideally travel full-time. Admittedly, this trip in particular was motivated by the fact that I had some soon-to-expire airport lounge passes that I was trying to use. So in order to keep the costs low, I was pretty open about where I would end up going, wherever the tickets were cheapest. Usually when I travel solo, especially for leisure or for relaxation, I go for places where I think I can really wander aimlessly and just walk and hopefully land somewhere interesting. Before this trip, I was basically looking up flights and destinations that would be cheap for the dates that I was looking for, and ended up with Québec City. So my flight ticket, which I booked through Chase Travel Portal, my flight going to Canada was through United and my flight back was through Air Canada. My round trip ticket cost was $243.74, or converted to roughly about 352 Canadian dollars. Another pre-travel expense was my accommodations. As a solo traveler, it's usually the cheapest thing to go for a hostel, and Québec City has a lot of hostel options and they're all pretty well reviewed. I ended up staying at a hostel in the middle of Old Québec, which cost $166.28 USD for 5 nights. Converted, that is roughly 224 Canadian dollars. One last thing I purchased before the trip, because at this point I had been building up my itinerary and taking into consideration what things I would do. One must try that I highly recommend doing if you ever visit Quebec is to visit the Nordic spa, Strom Spa. There's a location right by Old Québec, and it was very convenient to go to. It was walking distance from my hostel. So I pre-bought a ticket for that just so that I could block and book the date that I wanted to be there for. So that ticket cost $63 US, but I'm gonna include that cost on the day that I actually visit that trip because we're gonna do daily totals. With that, let's go. Day one was a travel day. I took an Uber from the airport because my flight was at 6 a.m. and that Uber cost $27 US. Like I said, I mainly booked this trip to use the airport lounges, so that's where the day starts. So I got to the lounge at around 5:30. It was pretty empty. This was also a pretty small lounge because this wasn't a major hub airport for United. There's nothing special, but I was able to get some breakfast, a couple of snacks for the road. Key tip for anyone traveling solo is to bring a small Tupperware, because having Tupperware handy to store some of your leftovers and eat them later on is a great budget and solo travel hack. So I had a layover in Chicago and the second lounge was much bigger. This was still pretty early in the day, so it was definitely too early for lunch. We're gonna call it a brunch, but it was still definitely the breakfast menu, but that's okay. Again, this was a budget trip. I was trying to not spend any money at the airports at all. I visited 2 lounges this one day because I knew I wasn't gonna have the opportunity to visit a United lounge on my trip back, so I had to squeeze them both on my departure day in whichever airport I ended up landing at. And then after landing in Québec City, I took the bus from the airport, which required one transfer in the middle. Transfers are free for the buses in Quebec. That bus takes you all the way to Old Québec, which was where my hostel was. The cost for the bus is typically $3.50 Canadian. However, I actually ended up not using the ticket that I purchased. I had purchased the ticket at the airport while I had Wi-Fi through the airport, but waited a little last minute before I activated it on my phone, and you need to activate it on your phone to show the bus driver. And the bus had just suddenly arrived and I hopped on panic because I didn't want to miss it, but realized I didn't actually press activate, and the bus driver just let me on even though I didn't activate my ticket. And I'd asked him if there was Wi-Fi on the bus, and there isn't. I wasn't able to activate the ticket, and I did have to attempt to explain to to the next driver after the transfer what had happened, and at some point I think they just let me on. But the real mistake was actually my eSIM. Whenever you're traveling internationally, I always recommend pre-buying an eSIM ahead of time so that when you get to the country of your destination, you can activate it, which I had done. And as soon as I landed in Toronto during my layover, actually, I tried to activate it immediately to get connected to mobile data, but it did not work. So it just seemed like this eSIM or this particular company or provider just was a little bit faulty. It wasn't connecting to the local networks. And so I struggled. Like, I think I sat down at the Québec airport after arrival for like 30 minutes to an hour before leaving the airport, just trying to figure out how to get the eSIM to work. And it really never did. And so I kind of gave up and I just hoped for the best and tried to do what I could with the airport Wi-Fi and just get to my hostel and figure it out there. But again, this whole thing happened with the bus ticket, and so by the time I got back to the hostel and got Wi-Fi access, I ended up sending a support ticket to the eSIM provider, and none of their tips were able to fix it. So I ended up just requesting a refund and then having to buy an eSIM from a different brand just so that I would have connection during my trip. So, you know, mistakes were made, lessons were learned. I don't know if it's just that provider was not reliable, or just their Canada network wasn't working, or just the eSIM that I particularly got delivered wasn't working. Who knows? I'm probably never going to use that provider again. Maybe it's because I was being cheap and that was my fault, but lessons learned. Anyway, at this point, we can include the cost of the eSIM to day one's expense. So that was $15 Canadian, and the cost of my unused bus ticket will be included in this day as well. So we've arrived in Old Québec, and my first meal upon arrival to Canada 100% should be poutine. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I'm probably not. Also, Quebec is a French-speaking part of Canada. It's a very, very French-speaking city. So I am probably gonna have to say a lot of French names and words, and I might butcher the pronunciation, so I'm sorry. One of the spots I had found through other YouTube travel vlogs in Quebec that was recommended was Poutineville. See, when you say it the American way of Poutineville, that sounds better with the Ville part, but Poutineville sounds a little weird. Anyway, I ended up going to Poutineville, which was a restaurant that lets you customize your own poutine. So you can pick and choose what kinds of fries and cheese and toppings you want on it. I got the junior size poutine with the regular brown sauce, fries, and curds, but I added mushrooms and Philly steak. I also got a drink. I got the Quebec Mule, and so the total for this dinner ended up being $37.82. That included taxes and tip, or in US dollars, $27.21. After dinner, I decided to walk around for a bit, but it was pretty cold, and I decided to call it a night because it was a pretty tiring day. The day one total was $94.96 Canadian, or $67.57 USD. Day two, or my first full day in Quebec City, I generally like to keep my itineraries pretty loose, especially on a solo trip. I try to not have to pack my schedule or feel like I need to be anywhere at any point in time. Just the vibes of no rushing and no panicking, and there's no way to be late for anything is just really the main goal of taking a trip like this for me. I generally just have blocks, so either the morning or afternoon or evening of day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Just having a general idea of what area of the city I might end up in and what activities might go with being in that area. I really like walking around. Part of that is just understanding that it might take me a really long time, or I might be walking for a few hours, and whatever area I find myself strolling around is where I'll find things to do. So in order for that to work, I also pre-save a lot of different locations and destinations and food places on my Google Maps of the city I plan on visiting beforehand, and just have that map ready to go so that whenever I find myself in a specific part of the city, then I can just check the map and see what's close by, and then work that in and just visit any place that I feel like. Since my hostel was in the heart of Old Québec, I was very close to a lot of the main sites, specifically the Dufferin terrace. I'm not going to be very good at providing any historical context for any of the sites in Quebec City. It's a very historical city. There's so much information about it that you can find out, and I do highly recommend taking a guided tour if you ever visit the city to learn more about it. I don't want to spoil it for anyone who's thinking about visiting, you know? I ended up following some stairs that went up a trail, and that took me to the top of the Citadel of Quebec. And eventually I ended up at the Plains of Abraham. People sometimes mention it, but I don't know if it's very clear for people that Quebec City is a very hilly and stairs heavy city because the main part of it, Old Quebec, is up on elevation, while the rest of it, like the outer parts of the city, are on lower land. So there's a lot of uphill places, directionally speaking. So if you plan on walking the city a lot, like I did, be prepared to have to climb up a lot of uphill streets, climb up a lot of stairs, and also work your way down, because sometimes walking downhill is also pretty rough. But yeah, have your walking shoes on, be ready for that, because there's a lot of that. So I ended up in the Plains of Abraham, which is a nice big park, and I decided to walk along the park just to enjoy the sights, enjoy the views, take a few clips here and there. And I decided to walk towards Avenue Cartier. See, the word avenue is English, but then the Cartier, I don't even know how to say it in English.
Cartier Avenue.
Cartier, oh God.
Avenue Cartier.
I don't know why that's going to be one of the hardest things to pronounce for me, but I was headed to that area because I had a few patisserie and cafe options saved, so I figured it would be a good place to grab a little snack before I kept walking around some more. Also, this part of the city is on the higher elevation, so I wanted to avoid having to like walk downhill and then have to come back uphill at any point in time. I ended up grabbing an almond croissant from Bauderon et Fils for about $5 and some fries or frites from Le Charcutier du Marché. And I actually did do a stop at a pharmacy real quick. I didn't film that, not really important for a travel vlog, but it was just some things that I forgot to pack. So I'm just going to include that for the sake of what I actually spent. And then I walked back around to the Plains of Abraham. I ended up taking a little break at La Maison Smith Cafe in the middle of the park because I had some time to kill. So I got a chai latte for $6.12 Canadian. And so I decided to head towards Petit Champlain, which is like a shopping street, but that is downhill of the elevation. And actually from the place I was at earlier, the Dufferin terrace has the funicular, which is a little slow riding thing that kind of serves like an elevator that can take you from up on the terrace and down to Petit Champlain, which is that little street. But instead, because I was on the Plains of Abraham, I decided to do the walk around and head down in that direction, but along the river walk. I followed a trail. It ended up leading me to the Cap Blanc stairs, which happened to be Quebec City's longest historic staircase, which I will admit was a little bit terrifying to walk down. It was nice and hugged by like nature, so it wasn't like big exposure, but if you're afraid of heights, that staircase might not be for you. Just a warning. From down there, there was a trail path that went along the river. So I decided to just walk along that path and, you know, take my time and make my way towards Cartier Petit Champlain. I was able to try a tourist classic maple taffy. I enjoyed it for the experience. I was happy to try it. Probably would not buy it again because it was pure sugar, but yeah, Canadian maple syrup, great thing. I think that was about $3. I did end up paying for that in cash, so I won't be including that in the daily total because I don't have a consistent idea of what the exact prices for the things I spent cash on were because I didn't get receipts for everything. So I will be including a total cash spent at the end of the video, and that's where these amounts will end up going. Walking along Petit Champlain and looking through the stores and, you know, doing a bit of window shopping here and there, I ended up coming across Fromagerie Ferme Old Québec is the name of the place, where they do a lot of goat's cheese product. So they have a free tasting of goat's cheese. I Ended up buying some goat's milk soft serve at this place, which I also spent cash here. And if I remember correctly, I think the ice cream was about maybe $4 or $5 Canadian. Then after that, I strolled around some more to kill some more time. Again, I was still too early for my dinner reservation, so when I was doing my pre-trip research, I found out that the city had an annual event called Québec Gourmande, basically where a bunch of nice and fancy restaurants will offer a fixed like 3-course menu or meal for tiered fixed prices. There's like a cheap option, a mid option, and a more expensive option. For this particular case, which was in the beginning to the middle of November, it was either $25, $45, or $65 depending on the restaurant that you go to. We happen to have something very similar locally in the city I live in that we call Restaurant Week. So I was pretty familiar with the setup, and so I was really excited that they had an event like this overlapping with my travel dates. For this night, I had booked a reservation at Brasserie Le Modus for the $25 fixed menu, which included a seafood soup for the appetizer with some goldfish crackers. For the main, it was a braised bavette with gratine dauphinois and carrots, and it was a maple syrup pie for dessert. Along with the wine and the tip, the total for that dinner ended up being $50.24 Canadian or $36.14 US. After dinner, I decided to walk around a little bit more and circle down to Rue Saint-Jean or Saint Jean Street, which has a bunch of little shops and restaurants and is really close to my hostel. So I ended up buying a pair of earrings from a souvenir shop, and I picked up a small bag of another tourist classic, the Quebec style popcorn at Mary's Boutique. So this brings the total for day 2 to $134.40 Canadian or $96.68 USD. And for anyone wondering, because I mentioned the hills and the steps and the walking, my total steps hit 24,327 that day, along with having climbed 75 floors according to my Fitbit. So we're on day 3, and on this day I had signed up for a free walking tour that is organized by the hostel that I was staying at. Because it was a standard walking tour of Old Québec specifically, the walking tour ended up bringing us to some similar spots that I had already been to the day before on my own. But that wasn't that big of a problem. Our tour guide was giving us much more information and context and historical facts about each of the spots we were visiting, and we ended up going to a few other places that I didn't go to before. Because this was a free tour, it is recommended that you tip your tour guide. So I tipped my tour guide in cash. Again, that's going to be included in the cash expenses at the end of the video. After the walking tour, I ended up having lunch with a few of the people in my tour group that I made friends with at the Shaker Kitchen and Mixology restaurant. We all ended up getting French onion soup for no particular reason. That ended up costing me $17.18. That's after tip and taxes. I had checked my block itinerary plans and decided to actually switch my days and instead try to go to Montmorency Falls this day. I had originally planned on going the day after, but the forecast said that it was going to rain and I didn't want to have to go to the falls on a rainy day, and I knew it was going to take a couple of hours. So since we were done with the tour by around lunchtime, I had the entire afternoon to figure out the process of going to Montmorency Falls. So the cool thing about Montmorency Falls, which is a massive waterfall that is close to Quebec City, is that it is accessible by public transport. So I was just able to take the local RTC bus to get there. I think it was bus number 800. It's much cheaper than having to pay for a guided tour via like a tour bus or by renting a car. I realized that I needed to pee, so I did a quick stopover at the McDonald's that was just across the street. The park entrance was free. There was nobody at the gates, I think, so I'm pretty sure it was free. It was already off season. This was again in November, and I think the park becomes free for entry when it is not peak summer season. The bus also drops you off at the top of the falls, so if you look up how to get around Montmorency Falls and what to expect when you go there, usually they say that you either have to climb the very famous 487 steps to get to the top of the falls, or that you have to pay for the cable cars that take you up there. But again, public transport, the bus drops you off at the top of the falls, and you get to like hike in and come in from the top, and you get access straight to the bridge that overlooks the falls immediately. So that was nice. Admittedly, I did go down a significant portion of the 487 steps until I decided it was getting a little too wet and that I would struggle to make it back up. So I did not take all 487, but I did climb up a few of them. Quite a bit of it actually, just to get to the nice viewpoints at the bottom. I ended up taking the bus back into the city, and now it had started to rain for the night, so I ended up deciding to have dinner at the hostel. But before that, I had to pick up some things for the dinner. At some point, I decided that it might be a fun idea to do like a little solo charcuterie moment. I found a cute little gourmet grocery store that had all sorts of cheeses and other accoutrements. So the girl working there was so nice and helpful and gave me suggestions on a few different cheeses, and per my request sliced off really small portions of the cheese so that I could end up with small enough quantities because I knew I was eating all of this by myself. So she was super helpful and I was really thankful for that. That stuff cost about $20. I also picked up some bread and an eclair at Paillard, which is a bakery chain, I believe. And I also ended up picking up some charcuterie meat at another little store along the way. So with all of my items collected and gathered, I put together a quick little plate and had a chill, quiet night in at my hostel. So day 3's total comes out to $72.18 Canadian or $51.99 USD. Again, for anyone who cares, I also hit 20,991 steps and I climbed 62 floors. Day 4, I had previously mentioned the forecast said it was going to be a rainy day. I was gonna keep it pretty chill, and my target destination for this day was a indoor food court called Le Grand Marché, which is the Grand Market. It is notably a little bit far from Old Québec. I think it's about just under 4 kilometers away. It's far enough that it is probably more recommended to take a bus to go there. However, I had no other plans for this day, so I decided I wanted to take my time and walk some more. So I walked the 3.8 kilometers that it was to get there, and also ended up walking back the whole way. Going there was mostly downhill, so it was all fine, but the walk back was uphill at the very end, and that was an experience. But again, we made it, we survived, we're here. Before I made the trek, I ended up grabbing a quick hot cider at a random coffee shop just because I realized I had forgotten my earphones back at the hostel and needed to circle back because I was not about to raw dog that 2-hour, 3-hour walk. The beginning of the walk was generally all right and pretty chill. Again, it was mostly downhill, and around half of the walk was on a river trail along the St. Charles River. So that was really nice, and it was a little bit wet because it was raining that day, but it was also a Tuesday in the middle of the day, so there were not a lot of other people out on the trails, and it was nice and chill. And I saw ducks along the way. By the time I got to Le Grand Marche, it was quite empty. While I was there, I decided to try out a couple of different places because I hung around there for quite a bit. I decided like between each place, I was just sitting down and chilling and reading. I think this is the name on the receipt, and I'm not sure if this is actually the name of the restaurant. L'Iterie Charlevoix. From that place, I got a soup du jour, or the soup of the day, which I think was a leek and turnip soup, and a grilled cheese. In total, that was $16.10 Canadian or $11.61 USD. Through strolling around, I also ended up getting a cookie from Dominique Gourmande. The lady working there, who I think is also the owner, was so sweet and so nice. And then I ended up getting a millefeuille from La Boîte à Pain, and that was $7.43 Canadian. I also ended up picking up some small souvenirs and little snack things to take home for my family. I did end up paying in cash, so again, that'll be at the end of the video. After spending a bit of time at the Grande Marche and kind of waiting for the bulk of the rain, like the hard pour rain, to slow down, although I feel like I found a lull moment when I stepped out and then it started pouring again. But I was trying to wait out a little bit of the rain and kind of time it nicely so that it was roughly dinner time by the time I got back to Old Québec. So I walked back to my hostel first just to dry off a little bit. At this point, it was dinner time and I decided that it was time to get another poutine, this time at Chez Acheton, which is a chain and is a bit more of a fast food vibe, but it is highly recommended by a lot of locals. That cost $14.03 Canadian. I then decided that this was going to be the night that I went out. I know it's a Tuesday, but when I was looking around for some recommendations of nightlife in Québec City, a lot of people recommended the Drague Cabaret, and they host a drag bingo on Tuesday nights. I was a little bit early for it, so I decided to pop in next door at Ninkasi, which is a local brewery. I think ended up watching coverage of the US elections because this was Tuesday, November 5th. At some point, I head over to Drag Bingo because it was about time for it to start, and honestly had a pretty great time despite not understanding anything at all. The drag queen that was hosting the bingo night was pretty much speaking entirely in French, aside from the number callouts, and would like occasionally translate small snippets. I'm sure she was hilarious, but no, I did not understand 90% of what was happening that night. Anyway, that's day 4, totaling out to $78.75 Canadian or $59.60 USD. My total steps for this day was 23,540, and I apparently climbed the equivalent of 51 floors. So we are now on day 5. So this was my last full day in Québec City. I deliberately wanted to save the Nordic spa experience for this day because I knew I was going to do a lot of walking and that I was going to be exhausted, and I just thought it was a great way to end my trip. I had done my research and I knew that the spa doesn't allow you to leave the spa in the middle of the day to like get food or anything like that and come back. So once you like check in, you're in. And that the in-house restaurant, as nice as it sounded, was quite expensive. So I made the plan to make sure to eat before going in and to leave in time for dinner. The one area at this point I realized I hadn't made a visit to yet was actually pretty close to Strom Spa, or at least in the direction of it. So I decided to look for a place to get brunch at the Grand Allee. I ended up going to Petit chalet, and I had the fish and chips and a smoothie. After that, I made my way over to Strom Spa. I don't have much footage at the spa because they did not allow phones or camera devices in the experience areas. I did bring my e-reader around with me so that whenever I was in one of the relaxation rooms, I could read my books. I will say the experience was absolutely amazing, 100% worth it, 10 out of 10, would do it again. Would do it multiple times if I could, honestly. Yeah, they had hot and cold plunges. I tried to follow their recommended cycle of spending 20 to 30 minutes in a hot bath, 10 to 15 seconds in a Nordic ice cold bath, and then spending some time in either a sauna or relaxation room or both. And I think I was able to do the full cycle like about 3, maybe 4 times because I was really trying hard to make sure to try out all of the pools and all of the different rooms that they had. So, and I also spent quite some time in the lazy river. It was pretty small, but I enjoyed it. So yeah, if you are in Quebec or if you are anywhere where there's a Nordic spa, I would just highly recommend that experience. In the evening, I decided it was dinner time and I headed back out. I ended up on Rue St. Paul to get dinner at pizzeria number 900 because they also had the Table Gourmande menu promo happening, and their menu was also for $25. This dinner was absolutely amazing. I just have to say that I loved it. Every single bit of it. It was so good. The appetizer was this refreshing, zesty artichoke and ricotta salad slash dip. It had tomatoes and balsamic, and it was paired with this freshly baked piece of pizza dough. It was so good. The main was a choice between two different kinds of pies. One was a vegetarian option, but I went with a non-vegetarian option because it sounded more specialty and more unique. So it was a gorgonzola and speck pizza, which had caramelized onions. It was so rich and salty and perfectly cooked with the right amount of toastedness and chewiness in the pizza. And you get the entire pie for this price, right? Which is so worth it. They also had this spicy oil that you can drizzle on your pizza, and that, oh my God, elevated the pizza like so good. I made a call halfway through the pizza that I could not finish the entire pie by myself, and so they gave me a box to go, and I was able to take the other half of it back. So once I got back to my hostel, I was able to pack the rest of the pizza in my Tupperware and ended up eating the rest of it at the airport during my layover the next day. So I ended up not having to buy lunch at the airport the next day. Like I said, budget travel hacks. Then the dessert were these two dainty little tarts. One was lemony and tangy and had like a cream base, and the other was nutty and rich. I think it was pistachio flavored. Perfectly sized that even after I was full from eating half of a pie of pizza, we always have room for dessert. All of it was absolutely amazing. I love this meal. This was probably my favorite meal of this trip. It's well worth the total of $48.92 Canadian or $35.41 USD. My God, you could not have that good of a meal for $35 in America. That's crazy. And that's after tax and tip. Highly recommend Pizzeria number 900. After dinner, I realized I hadn't yet picked up a magnet souvenir. I traditionally just like to pick up like a couple of magnets that have like the city's name on them whenever I travel. One goes to my mom to put on her fridge, and one I keep for myself to put on our fridge. So I kind of had to scramble to look for a souvenir shop or a gift shop that was open late enough. I was really happy to find a gift shop that was open this late. I didn't have time to be picky about pricing or whatever. I ended up getting more than just the magnets, so my total was $29.75 Canadian or $20.59 USD. At this point, it was pretty late, so I decided to just head back to my hostel and call it a night because I had to be up early the next day to make it to the airport in time. Day 5's total, including the pre-purchase ticket to Strom Spa, was $201.27 Canadian or $141.90 USD. This is the most expensive day so far because of the spa, but girl math says because I paid for it almost a month before, it's free, right? Anyway, this again was my last full day in Quebec, so I hit 19,489 steps. And for some reason, my Fitbit says 169 floors, which I'm pretty sure is definitely not right. So it might have glitched or was miscalculating something weird because I was in the water for most of this day, because I'm pretty sure I did not hit more floors on this day than I did in any of the other previous days. So I'm just gonna, ignore that. But I was wearing my Fitbit while I was at the spa and going into the tubs and stuff. It might have been that like each loop in the lazy river felt like a floor to the watch. I don't really know. If anybody knows anything about how Fitbits calculate the floors climbed estimate, let me know. But yeah, that was a little weird, but that's the end of day 5. So on to day 6, my final day in Quebec City and my final day in Canada. Just as I had been doing every single day, I had a quick breakfast down at the hostel's dining room and packed up all my stuff and headed out to the bus stop. And then during my layover in Montreal, just before leaving, I did decide that I could not leave Canada before buying some Tim Hortons. Specifically, as my mom told me to. She was like, make sure you visit Tim Hortons while you're in Canada. That's the thing there, right? And I was like, all right, I'm gonna get Tim Hortons. And I sent her a picture of it. So I got a maple donut before getting on the plane and heading back home. After landing back on American soil, I arrived back in my home airport kind of in the middle of the afternoon. I think my arrival time was around 2 or 3 p.m. So I wasn't really in a rush because I didn't have anywhere to be and it was the middle of the day and I had very little luggage for this trip. Actually, I traveled only with carry-on. So I decided to, for the first time, try taking the public transit buses from the airport to get myself home. Normally, I would either take an Uber because I live close enough to the airport where it's not usually that expensive, but that's usually if I have a lot of stuff with me, or if I don't have a lot of stuff, then I would take the train that gets you from the airport to the center of the city. However, I realized that there are also bus options, and it wasn't terribly inconvenient for me to use them to get myself home, at least in comparison to the trains. And it's cheaper. It was an adventure. The bus itself that got me to the city was perfectly fine, but the connecting bus that would have gotten me home, I think, ended up being late or delayed, so I had to like walk around a bit to find a different bus to get me the rest of the way. But because transfers are free, I only ended up spending $2 to get myself home from the airport, which is great. Did it take me over an hour to get home when normally it would only take like 15 or 20 minutes by Uber? Yes, but I'm from the Philippines where it can take up to like 3 hours just to get to the airport in Manila because of traffic. So I have no complaints. This is fine. But yeah, and so my day 6 total was $9.05 Canadian or $6.48 USD. Okay, so in conclusion, I'm gonna put up each day's total. So I've got my round trip flight cost of the accommodations or the hostel that I stayed at for 5 nights, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, and day 6 totals. And like I previously mentioned, the cash expenses, I don't know exactly how much I spent on every single thing when I was paying in cash, but I do know that I withdrew $100 Canadian in cash, which including the fees was roughly around $73.50 USD. And I came back with about 27 Canadian dollars left in change. So I'm gonna estimate my cash spend at about $73 Canadian or $54.60 USD. Adding that to these daily totals, this gives us a grand total of $1,029.53 Canadian or $737.76 USD for 6 days and 5 nights in Québec City, Canada as a solo traveler. Obviously, price points and the perception of budgets are relative and can be different depending on where you are and the cost of living and how much you make. The idea of what is high or low budget will differ greatly between different people from different backgrounds and different incomes. But for a trip to a major city in North America, I think this was at a pretty reasonable cost range, especially for a solo traveler. So I just wanted to share my experience on here and hope that I can encourage people who are interested in traveling but might be on a lower budget that it's definitely still feasible and that it shouldn't cost thousands of dollars just to explore the world. I hope to inspire more people, especially women, that it's okay to travel alone and that solo travel shouldn't be this scary, daunting, impossible thing. I probably won't be having many more travel vlogs anytime soon, given my limitations in budget, but I hope to get the opportunity to make more of these. Hope this helps.